A very common question that I get asked as someone with a technical background who started a company are, what are the new trends? And what people expect to hear from someone like me is like, oh, it's IoT, it's AI, it's blockchain, whatever. And those are all really interesting technologies. But honestly, I think there's a trend that's much more significant and much more disruptive that's happening. And it's kind of a meta trend or a macro trend. And it's a trend that I've been obsessing with now for the last couple of years, and I think it's going to shape basically the entire B2B landscape for the next 10 years. So what do these companies have in common? It's not blockchain, it's not AI, it's not IoT. So it turns out the thing that they have in common is that they've decided to go to market in a way that's very different than traditional B2B. So they decided to first do what we call growth, which is a very consumer bottom-up motion. And then they decided to overlay sales after that. So we call this B2B growth sales. But the implication is today you can build a company using two motions, which basically is fully advantageous to startups, and it's very difficult for incumbents to defend against. For number one, they tend to require a lot less money to start. They're much less focused on typical execution. To be a founder of a B2B growth startup or B2B growth sales, it's much more about being very, very good at product and much less about understanding channels and understanding sales. But right now, like, the incumbents really don't have any defense strategy against this. Like, it's very hard for like a Cisco or an IBM or an HP or an SAP to defend against this sort of a motion. And not only that, because the growth motion, which I'm going to talk about, is really a marketing-led motion, B2B startups can now really come from anywhere. And that's just not been the case in the past. There's really been very, very few centers for real strong B2B companies. And now we're seeing them everywhere. Berlin, France, UK, certainly New York, as well as Silicon Valley. Now, growth in some of these motions have been around for a very long time, right? When Salesforce, especially in vertical SaaS, so like, Salesforce for a very long time has been doing like freemium. The reason I'm giving this talk now is because the trend is so massive, it cuts across basically every vertical, whether that's security, it's open source, it's developer tooling, it's bottoms-up SaaS, it's infrastructure, it's cloud services. I would say any successful modern company, the chances are that it's using this strategy today. And if companies are not using this strategy, they're actually at a disadvantage. So let me talk through really quickly what I mean when I talk about this trend. So to do this, I want to back up and split the world into consumer companies and enterprise companies traditionally, and kind of how the world views them. So consumer companies are typically marketing-led. And that drives everything else about the company. Why is it marketing-led? Because if your customer is a consumer, there's no way you're going to pay a sales force to go talk to every one of them. There's just no way. And so the way that you get out to consumers is you do these marketing campaigns, and that drives the company. Enterprise, on the other hand, has been sales-led, which is if you're going to build a product for the enterprise, the expectation is somebody's going to sell it. More importantly, if you're building a product that a consumer has to adopt organically through marketing, it has to be very simple. Simple to use, simple to understand. Where if you have a salesperson selling something, you actually benefit by more knobs because it'll demonstrate more value. I mean, I hear often people say, why does IBM or SAP make such complicated products? Don't they know how to build products? That's actually missing the point. The point is I want something as complicated that shows as much value so I can extract as many dollars as possible. And that's why enterprise products have just been gross. They've been gross for a very long time. In the consumer world, you really care about brand. Think Coca-Cola, think Apple. Where in the enterprise, it's much more about long business sales. And the economics, the way we value them, are very different. So I want to kind of double click on that. Let's take this from the VC perspective. So how do VCs traditionally think about consumer companies and enterprise companies? We're going to start with consumer. Okay, here's the reality. Nobody knows how to evaluate consumer companies before they go into the market. Like, you ask me the question, what do 19-year-olds in Berlin like? I haven't a clue. So I sit, of course, in all the partner meetings at Andreessen Horowitz. We have many companies come in. I've probably seen 9 dog-walking companies in the last year. Now, what differentiates these dog-walking companies? It's not technology. They all kind of say the same thing. Yet, eventually, one of them is going to win. And this plays out in many consumer companies. It's very rare that you've got some sort of crazy technical moat in a consumer company, but some are just good at making products that users like, and they end up becoming winners. And as a result, the investment community has kind of come up with this ethos around investing in consumer, which is basically the graph is smarter than whatever theory we have about the market. So if someone comes in and they pitches me the next Snapchat, listen, I'm a 40-year-old that grew up in the country. I have no idea if it's good, but if I look at the numbers behind it, I do. And we as an investment community, we've created an entire calculus on understanding what's a good consumer company and not a good consumer company. So if you ever hear things like, MAUs and DAOs and engagement and the smile curve, all of that came out of the last 10 years of investors trying to understand how to evaluate consumer companies, and none of it is like, oh, I looked at the app and it was cool. Enterprise companies are much different. Enterprise companies, you assume there's a core technology that's being developed, and you assume that the buyer is rational. Consumer buyers are totally irrational. Like, why is something taking off? No idea. That's weather prediction. But an enterprise buyer, normally the buying motion is based on some business need. And if I'm an investor in B2B, which I am, I just call the enterprise and I'm saying, hey, do you need this, yes or no? And if the answer is yes, then it makes sense to make the investment, even prior to having traction. There's fewer people to call, and they're a much more rational buyer. So in general, when you think about investing in these two areas, in consumer, you want very strong product founders, and you can't really invest until you see that it's working, right? There's no other way to really understand what's going on. Where in the enterprise, typically there's a strong technical problem being solved. It requires a lot of money to build the initial product, but you can kind of understand what's going to happen on the enterprise, so you invest early. That's been Silicon Valley for the last 20 years. But all of this is changing now. Think Dropbox, think Twilio, think Atlassian, think SurveyMonkey, think GitHub. Pretty much most of the modern success stories in B2B lately have been this combination of bottoms-up growth and then sales, and that really changes everything. So let me very quickly talk about how these are constructed. Normally, the company starts with some very simple use case, very simple product. It could be open source, it could be freemium, it could be an app. And they try and get users just like a consumer company would. So they'll do all the bottoms-up stuff you do, content marketing, SEO, whatever you can to get adoption. And then once that's working, and you'll iterate on that until it's working, you grow that engine so you have a huge user base. And then you build a sales engine behind that to monetize that user base, and you have sales efficiencies that are far better than we've ever seen before in B2B. And then once you have that hook, once you have that user base, you actually make the product much more complex so that you can actually deliver enterprise value. So why does this work now? It's actually straightforward. We are the App Store generation. Buying software is something everybody does. It's a daily ritual for all of us. And so, it's quite possible. So before, you could really only sell software to core IT in the enterprise. Today, it's HR, it's P&L holders, it's marketing, it's anybody else. So it's quite possible to get access to these buyers. So let me go through a few examples of this and then why it's so hard. So here's one example is SurveyMonkey. So SurveyMonkey within, 10 years got to 60 million registrations. Assuming you can monetize, say, $20 a year, it's like $3 a month, that's a $1.2 billion business. It's very rare that you have businesses this large in the enterprise, but if you actually read the quote from the earnings call, you'll see that growth alone isn't sufficient. So you can build these beautiful curves of users, but then you still have to build sales on top of that. Dropbox is an example of where you invest mostly in bottoms-up growth and less on sales. Again, you've got a great public company, looks like a consumer company. Again, this is very rare traditionally in the enterprise. But on the earnings call, an admission that the majority of the growth is from organic methods, and now we need to start thinking about sales. It's very easy for me to stand up here and saying, oh, okay, the new companies have growth and they have sales and it's great and we all win. The reality is it's way, way more difficult than that. So much so, I don't think anybody right now actually understands how to build these. And as investors, we certainly don't understand how to evaluate them. And the reason is, if you're a founder and you're managing these two motions, growth and sales, the interaction between the two is incredibly complicated. It's very complicated for us to evaluate, but there are so many failure modes and there's so many ways to get this wrong that the majority of these end up failing. So I want to talk about this actual complexity, because doing something that's pure growth is pretty straightforward. It's hard to execute, but it's pretty easy to understand. Doing pure sales is pretty easy to understand, hard to execute, but doing them both, the interplay between these two curves is incredibly complex. So let me give you an example. This is a straightforward case. If you just do bottoms-up growth and no sales, don't worry about the graph, that's notional. It turns out that your monetization can only grow as fast as growth, and growth tends to be slower for B2B users than it does for the consumer. So unless you have a network effect like GitHub or LinkedIn and you're really lucky, you often end up with slower growing companies. On the other hand, let's say you do the traditional approach of only sales and no bottoms-up growth. So I would say that, again, today, most successful startup companies in B2B have to do bottoms-up growth because it's the only way to actually get access to the buyer. If you don't have this, you kind of have no cred. You don't have a relationship. And core IT and core security buyers have too many people calling them in existing relationships. So this is becoming more and more difficult. Okay, let's say that you say, okay, all right, I'm going to do this. I'm going to build my new company. I'm going to do both of them. A very common problem is if you build a bottom-up growth engine, the users that adopt it may not end up being the users that will actually buy the product. And therefore, you'll end up with a growth engine that at the end of the day, you really can't monetize, because if you send a salesperson in there, the person that's a user has no idea who can actually pay for it. And I would say, especially in open source, this is one of the number one problems that we see people running into. There's another problem is like, the first stage of the company is to build this beautiful growth engine, right? And you want to do anything you can to make that look good because you want that nice curve to monetize later. The problem is if you give too much away or you invest too much in it, you may have nothing to sell. Again, it's another classic problem in open source. It's also a classic problem in vertical SaaS, which is, listen, if I open source everything, which I'm a huge fan, like my company had huge open source components, I'm on the board of many open source companies, but let's take the example of many of these core infrastructure components. If you're already giving it away, it's very hard to have something that sell on the other end, but if you hold too far back, you may not have the independent growth engine. There's another problem which is actually even worse, where sometimes you have kind of okay growth, so you release your open source project, people kind of like it, you don't invest a lot in it, and then you build sales, and then your sales catches up to your growth. Well, the problem in these situations is either you have two totally independent sales motions, one of them to your users and another one to those that don't know you, which is very hard for early sales teams to do, or your sales is limited by your growth engine. I would say a good 70% of open source companies run into this problem, is they figure out a little bit of the early growth side, they kind of get it working, and then they try and monetize that with the sales engine on the back end, and they quickly overcome their ability to do it. I'm just going to talk about one more. Here's another really classic one is, a lot of organic growth is popularity. It's being cool, man. Like, I've got this thing and it's open and it's branded and it's interesting and people like it and whatever it is. But what happens if you do that and then all of a sudden now you have someone like me walking in trying to sell it, right? Like, I'm not cool. as soon as you take these organic phenomenon and you have a sales engine behind it trying to monetize it, you make it more complex, you try and extract value, all of a sudden it may not be the cool thing and it erodes the organic growth. This problem is very common like collaboration tools and in vertical SaaS. So I just want to do a very quick product view and then I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. If you're going to execute on this, you want to start with a very simple product. You generally want it to be horizontal in nature when you first create it. You want to use the product to drive growth, to drive virality, to drive network effects. And then you want to be able to take that product and make it more complex and more vertical. We are right now standing at basically a new wave of B2B companies. I think the large exits recently say it. I actually think many of the incumbents are going to be unseated by B2B companies, and it's going to happen kind of faster and more value than we've ever seen before. And I think a core component is understanding how to build your company so you can take advantage of what's been learned in the consumer world and you can apply it to sales. And with that, I'm done. I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much.